Okay, so get ready because today we're going to take a deep dive into Mad Max Fury Road. And, we've got kind of a mix of stuff to work with here. IMDb for the, basic facts and figures, and then a whole bunch of user reviews. And, well, let's just say people have some thoughts about this one.
Yeah, it really seems like this movie kind of, pushes people's buttons one way or the other. And I
Yeah.
think that's what makes it so interesting for this deep dive. We can, not just look at the film itself, but also how people, reacted to it, what they thought of it, what they loved, what they hated.
Exactly. And before we kind of, get into all of that, maybe let's just start with the basics, like what we know for sure about the film. So IMDb tells us that Mad Max Fury Road came out in 2015, and it was directed by George Miller, who, also directed the original Mad Max trilogy way back when. And this time we've got Tom Hardy playing Max and Charlize Theron playing Imperator Furiosa, who a lot of people say is like, the real star of the show.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, just the scale of this thing, like the budget was something like $150 million,
Right.
which is, a lot of money for a film. And it definitely wasn't a flop. Like it made almost $380.5 million worldwide. So clearly this is a movie that a lot of people saw and had, pretty strong feelings about.
All right, so let's talk action because, that's what a lot of people seem to be focused on. And the words that keep coming up in these reviews are like spectacle, adrenaline, even like a master class in action filmmaking. Some people are even calling it the best action movie ever made.
And I think one of the things that makes the action so effective is that they really went all in on practical effects. Like Miller, the director, he really wanted to minimize the use of CGI, computer-generated imagery, and instead they actually built these crazy vehicles.
Yeah.
They did real stunts with real people, and you can feel that in the movie. It feels like you're right there in the middle of the action. Every crash, every explosion just feels real.
Yeah, so instead of like, drawing explosions on a computer, they were actually out there in the desert blowing stuff up.
Exactly. And it makes a huge difference. It gives the film this visceral quality that you just don't get from a lot of modern action movies that rely so much on CGI.
And speaking of things that make this movie stand out, we have to talk about Charlize Theron as Furiosa. I mean, she's not just some sidekick in this crazy world. She's like, a force of nature. Some reviewers are even saying she's the real heart of the film, maybe even more so than Max himself. One review even said she's more Mad Max than Mad Max.
Yeah, it's a real testament to both Theron's performance and Miller's writing.
Yeah.
I mean, Furiosa isn't just like, a badass warrior. She's got depth. She's complex. She's got her own motivations and vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
She's clearly been through a lot, but she's still fighting for something more, for hope, for redemption.
Okay, so I'm curious, why do you think she resonates so strongly with audiences? Is it just because she's a strong female character in a genre that's usually dominated by men, or is there something more going on there?
I think it's deeper than that. Yeah, it's definitely refreshing to see a woman who's not just waiting to be rescued. She's a leader. She drives the plot forward, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
I think she represents this kind of, resilience, this determination to survive and fight for a better future, even when things are really, really bad. And that's something that I think we can all relate to no matter who we are.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like she taps into this kind of universal desire for hope and agency in a world that it feels like it's kind of, spinning out of control.
Exactly. And Miller doesn't shy away from showing her flaws either.
Yeah.
Her scars, both physical and emotional.
Sure.
She's strong, but she's also vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes her so compelling as a character.
Okay, so we've got this incredible female lead. We've got this crazy over-the-top action, and we've got a director who's like, pushing the limits of practical filmmaking. But what about the world itself? Like from the reviews you've read, how would you describe the world that Miller created in Fury Road?
Visually, it's stunning, but it's also really unsettling. The world building is both imaginative and horrifying. Like, think about it, a desolate wasteland where water is more precious than gold, ruled by this tyrannical warlord, Immortan Joe, who hoards all the resources and controls people through fear and manipulation. It's a pretty bleak picture.
And those vehicles, right? I mean, we've got these spiky buggies and monster trucks, and there's even a guitarist like strapped to the front of a war machine playing heavy metal while they're driving into battle. I mean, it's crazy.
But it's a world where, survival is everything. And every aspect of life, from the clothes they wear to the vehicles they drive, reflects that it's brutal. But it's also strangely fascinating. Like the War Boys, for example, these pale, shaven-headed warriors who worship engines and are obsessed with dying in battle. It's a world that's both repulsive and alluring at the same time.
One thing that I noticed in the reviews is that some people thought the world building was like absurd or over the top. Do you think Miller went too far, or is that part of what makes the movie so unique?
That's a great question. I think it's a fine line.
No.
If you go too far with the craziness, it can lose its connection to reality and just become cartoonish.
Hmm.
But I think Miller does a pretty good job of balancing it. And the world is definitely exaggerated, but there's still this gritty realism to it.
Yeah.
The characters' motivations, the desperation for survival, those things feel real, even if the world itself is kind of fantastical.
So even though we're in this like insane post-apocalyptic world, there's still this like human element at the core of it.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Fury Road more than just a mindless action movie. It makes you think about things about yourself, about humanity.
Hmm.
It's a movie that stays with you.
So we've got this amazing action. We've got this complex female lead who kind of turns the whole, hero thing on its head. And we've got this world that's both mesmerizing and terrifying. But what about the story itself? Like a lot of the reviews seem to have some pretty strong opinions about the plot or maybe the lack of a plot.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting because some people thought the story was too simple, just chase across the desert without much character development. But other people thought that was a good thing. That it let the action and the world building take center stage.
All right, so let's dive into that a little bit more because this conversation is just getting started. Stick around as we unpack all of these different opinions about Mad Max Fury Road.
Yeah, so, picking up from where we left off, it is kind of interesting how some reviewers saw that, like, simple plot as a bad thing, and others thought it was actually, like, refreshing. Like, they liked that it wasn't, bogged down with too much story,
Yeah.
and that it just let the action and the world kind of, speak for themselves.
Yeah, reading through these reviews, I saw a lot of comments like, no plot, or, just one long chase scene. So, I mean, is it fair to say that, like, the plot is kind of secondary to the whole, action spectacle thing?
Well, I mean, there's definitely an argument to be made there. Like, the structure of the film is very linear. Furiosa escaping from Immortan Joe's Citadel with the 5 wives and Max getting caught up in the chase. And then it's just this, relentless pursuit across this crazy desert landscape.
But even with that, like, simple structure, there are some reviewers who saw these layers of, like, symbolism and deeper themes. Like, for example, Immortan Joe isn't just this, like, power-hungry warlord. He's almost like a cult leader, controlling his followers with this twisted ideology and the promise of a glorious afterlife.
Right. And that brings up some really interesting questions about, belief systems in a world that's been stripped of everything familiar, like the War Boys, for example. They're basically brainwashed from birth to believe that dying in service to Immortan Joe is like the greatest honor.
It's almost like Miller's trying to make us look at our own society, and how power structures manipulate people and exploit their need to belong and have a purpose.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And even within that, like, bleak system, we see characters like Nux the War Boy, who starts out as this, like, total fanatic, but he starts to change as he interacts with Furiosa and Max. He starts to question his beliefs and see the world differently.
Yeah, his character arc is really interesting. Like, it shows that even in the most messed up situations, there's still potential for growth and maybe even redemption.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole idea of the green place, this, like, mythical paradise that Furiosa and the 5 wives are searching for. Is it real? Is it just a symbol of hope, or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, some people saw it as a real place, a destination that's driving the characters forward, and others saw it more as like a metaphor for this human desire for something better, a world beyond the wasteland.
And Miller never really tells us for sure. It's left open to interpretation, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I like that it makes you think, it's not just spoon-feeding you the answers. You have to engage with the film and figure things out for yourself.
Exactly. And speaking of engaging with the film, we have to talk about the cinematography. Even the reviewers who didn't like the plot or the characters, they still praise the visuals.
Oh, yeah. The desert landscapes are incredible, vast and desolate, but also beautiful in a way. And the way Miller uses color and light, especially during those chase scenes, it's just amazing. It's like a ballet of, fire and steel and twisted metal.
And that's where those practical effects really shine through again. By doing things for real, Miller creates this sense of realism and immediacy that you just wouldn't get with CGI. You feel the heat, the dust, the impact of those crashes.
Do you think that's part of what makes Fury Road feel so timeless? This movie came out almost a decade ago, but it still feels so fresh and visceral.
I think you're right. There's something about practical effects that just feels more authentic, more grounded. And when you combine that with Miller's vision and the cinematography, it creates this really unforgettable experience.
Okay, so we've got the action, the themes, the visuals, but what about the emotional impact? Like, did you find anything in the reviews that talked about how Fury Road made people feel?
That's where things get really personal.
Yeah.
Some people felt like the film was emotionally cold and detached, like it was too focused on the action and didn't give the characters enough space to develop or for the audience to connect with them emotionally. But other people found these moments of, real beauty and even hope amidst all the chaos.
Yeah, I remember one review that talked about Furiosa's determination, the way she never gives up on protecting the five wives, even when things seem hopeless. That really resonated with me.
Right. And there's that scene where Max, who's been so, you know, hardened and cynical throughout the film, he makes this decision to give his blood to save Furiosa's life. It's a small thing, but it shows his humanity.
And even the ending, with Furiosa and the five wives finally reaching the Citadel and overthrowing Immortan Joe, it's not a typical happy ending, but there's this sense of triumph, of hope for a better future.
Absolutely. And that's what elevates Fury Road. Beyond just being an action movie, it's about survival resilience, the power of the human spirit. It makes you confront the darkness, but it also reminds you that there's still hope, even in the most desolate places.
So I'm curious, what were some of the specific criticisms that you saw in the reviews? You mentioned some people thought the plot was lacking, but were there other things that people didn't like?
One thing that came up a lot was the lack of dialogue. Fury Road is a very visual film. A lot of the story is told through action and images rather than words. Some people liked that, they thought it was refreshing and let the visuals speak for themselves. But others felt like it made the characters feel underdeveloped and the story feel emotionally distant.
Yeah, that makes sense. Dialogue is important for building character and conveying emotion, but I can also see how the lack of dialogue in Fury Road could add to the tension and urgency.
Exactly. It's a stylistic choice that definitely divided people. Some loved it, some hated it.
So it seems like Fury Road is a film that really defies easy categorization. It's a visual masterpiece, an action spectacle, a thought-provoking exploration of human nature, and it clearly gets people talking, both good and bad.
Absolutely. It demands your attention, it challenges your expectations, and it stays with you long after you've seen it. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating. It sparks conversation, debate, even disagreement. And that's what great art is supposed to do.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the crazy action to the deeper themes to the fact that people just seem to have really strong opinions about this film. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the different ways people interpret the characters, especially Max and Furiosa.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of why Fury Road is so compelling. It's like the film is a mirror reflecting back our own values and experiences. Like with Max, for example, some people saw him as this, stoic, almost mythical figure, a man of action. But others thought he was too passive, that he didn't have the same charisma as Mel Gibson in the older movies.
So it's like we're all watching the same movie, but seeing different versions of the same character.
Yeah.
What do you think explains that?
I think it comes down to what we as viewers are looking for in a hero.
Yeah.
Some people want a charismatic leader who talks a lot and drives the plot forward. Others are drawn to quiet strength, to characters who don't say much but let their actions speak louder than words.
Yeah, so it's like we're watching the same movie but through different lenses almost. And I think that leads to some really interesting conversations about, what we value in characters and stories and all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, you see the same thing with Furiosa, right? Like she's been praised as this, feminist icon, a symbol of female empowerment in this like brutal patriarchal world. But then you also have reviewers who are focusing more on her vulnerability, the trauma she's clearly been through and how that shapes her actions.
Right. And it's that combination of strength and vulnerability that makes her so compelling, I think, because she's not just this one-dimensional action hero. She's a survivor. She's a protector. She's fighting for something bigger than herself.
Absolutely. And it challenges those, traditional ideas of what a strong female character is supposed to be like. Often they're portrayed as being like emotionless and invincible.
Yeah.
But Furiosa is strong.
Yeah.
Yeah, but she's also human, and I think that's what makes her so powerful.
It's making me think about how I view characters in general. It's not about putting them into these neat little boxes, but about recognizing that they're complicated, they're contradictory, they're messy.
Exactly. And I mean, it's not just the characters that are open to interpretation, like even the setting itself, the wasteland in Fury Road, it almost functions as like a character in its own right.
That's interesting
Well, think about how the environment shapes the characters and their actions. The lack of resources, the constant threat of violence, the oppressive heat, all of that creates this sense of desperation and urgency that you feel throughout the entire film.
It's like the wasteland is this driving force in the narrative, pushing the characters to their limits and forcing them to make these impossible choices.
Exactly. And even within that harsh, unforgiving environment, you still see these glimmers of humanity, of compassion and connection, like the relationship between Furiosa and the Five Wives, or the bond that develops between Max and Nux.
Yeah, those moments really stand out, because they're happening against this backdrop of such brutality. It's like a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's still hope for kindness and connection.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the core messages of Fury Road.
Yeah.
Even in a world that's been ravaged by violence and chaos, there's still room for hope, for redemption, for connection. And that's a message that I think resonates really strongly, especially in times like these, when the world feels so uncertain and overwhelming.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Mad Max Fury Road, what final thoughts would you leave our listeners with?
I'd encourage them to embrace the ambiguity of the film, to really grapple with the questions it raises, and to find their own meaning in this, chaotic and captivating world, because Fury Road doesn't give you easy answers or neat resolutions. It challenges you to think critically, to feel deeply, to engage with its complexity, and that's what makes it such a powerful and lasting experience.
Well said. It's been a wild ride through the wasteland, and I'm definitely feeling inspired to revisit Fury Road and see what else I can find there.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's a film that you can watch multiple times and still find new things to appreciate, and who knows, maybe you'll even change your mind about some of your initial interpretations like we did in this deep dive.
That's the beauty of art, right? It's a conversation, it's an exploration, and there's always something more to discover. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Mad Max Fury Road. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.